April 22nd, 1942. 200 feet beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, Lieutenant Commander Hajime Nakagawa clutched his leather satchel against his chest as icy water rushed through the forward torpedo room of submarine I-73. He believed in those final moments that he would take his secrets to the ocean floor. He had no idea he was about to hand the Americans the key to winning the war. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Nakagawa didn't know was that a single decision, made in panic and darkness, would unlock the most closely guarded secret of the Imperial Japanese Navy and transform the entire course of the Pacific conflict. The morning had begun with routine confidence. Nakagawa had served aboard I-73 for 8 months, part of the Advanced Reconnaissance Force probing American defenses across the Hawaiian Islands. His role as communications officer meant he carried one of the most valuable items in the Japanese military, a JN-25 codebook, the master cipher used for all naval operations across the Pacific theater. The book itself was unassuming, bound in water-resistant leather, approximately 6 inches by 9 inches, containing hundreds of pages of 5-digit number groups that corresponded to words, phrases, and tactical commands. Only 63 copies existed in the entire Japanese fleet. The submarine had been operating near the island of Oahu since dawn, periscope depth, cataloging ship movements in Pearl Harbor. Captain Isamu Takahashi had pushed their patrol closer to shore than regulations typically allowed, eager to gather intelligence on American repair efforts following the attack 4 months earlier. Through the periscope, they had counted 7 battleships in various states of repair, 11 cruisers, 23 destroyers, and countless support vessels. Nakagawa had encoded all of it, his fingers moving across the codebook pages with practiced efficiency, transforming observations into encrypted messages ready for transmission. Nobody aboard I-73 noticed the American destroyer escort Lansdowne until it was almost directly above them. The first depth charge detonated 100 yards to starboard. The explosion sent a shockwave through the submarine that made the hull groan like a wounded animal. Emergency lights flickered. Men grabbed for handholds. Captain Takahashi immediately ordered evasive maneuvers, taking them deeper, changing course to northeast. But the Americans had marked them perfectly. A second pattern of charges bracketed them. Closer this time. Paint chips fell from the ceiling. A pipe ruptured near the engine room, spraying steam. The submarine shuddered with each concussion, and Nakagawa could feel the pressure changes in his ears, in his chest, in his teeth. 300 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort sat in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration building, surrounded by intercept operators and cryptanalysts. The space was called Station Hypo, though officially it didn't exist. Rochefort had been trying to break JN-25 for 6 months with limited success. His team could decipher perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted Japanese naval traffic, enough to know something significant was being planned, not enough to know what or where. They had stacks of encrypted messages, thousands of 5-digit number groups that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Rochefort hadn't slept more than 4 hours in any single night since January. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes were red, and he was drinking his 9th cup of coffee when the call came in about a submarine incident off Oahu. Back aboard I-73, the situation deteriorated rapidly. A third pattern of depth charges struck close enough to crack the pressure hull. Water began streaming in through a split seam near the forward battery compartment. The submarine was at 320 feet, well below its rated depth, and going deeper with each passing second. Captain Takahashi ordered all ballast blown, trying to force the submarine to surface, but the forward planes were jammed. They were sinking stern first at an angle that made walking difficult. Nakagawa found himself in the forward torpedo room with 6 other men, all of them focused on stopping the water rushing through a fracture in the hull. They worked frantically, stuffing blankets and clothing into the gap, but the pressure was too great. The water was ankle-deep, then knee-deep. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows. The angle of descent was increasing. Nakagawa's satchel, with the codebook inside, hung from his shoulder. Standard procedure was clear. destroy the codebook before capture or loss. He had a canvas bag weighted with lead for exactly this purpose. All he needed to do was place the codebook inside the bag and let it sink. But the water was rising faster than he had anticipated. Someone shouted that they were losing control of the stern. The submarine lurched violently to port. Nakagawa fell, slamming his shoulder against a torpedo tube. His satchel flew from his grip, sliding across the tilted deck into the rushing water. He scrambled after it, crawling on hands and knees, but another explosion above them sent him tumbling backward. When he regained his footing, the satchel was gone, swept toward the torpedo loading hatch. Captain Takahashi's voice came over the intercom, ordering all hands to prepare for emergency surface. They were blowing every tank, using the last of their compressed air, gambling everything on one desperate attempt to reach the surface. The submarine broke through with its stern rising first, water cascading off the deck, the conning tower emerging at a severe angle. They were visible now, exposed, and the Lansdowne was already closing distance. Takahashi gave the order to abandon ship. Hatches opened, men poured out onto the tilted deck, some diving into the water, others helping wounded crewmates. The submarine was going down again, this time for good, and everyone knew it. Nakagawa emerged from the forward hatch, soaking wet, without his satchel. He looked back into the flooding compartment where the codebook had disappeared beneath black water, and for a moment he considered going back. But the angle was too steep, the water too deep, and hands were pulling him toward the railing. He went into the Pacific with 72 other survivors, watching I-73 slip beneath the waves for the final time. The Lansdowne pulled all 73 men from the water. They were the first Japanese submarine crew captured largely intact during the war, and American intelligence officers were waiting at Pearl Harbor with questions. But the real prize wasn't the prisoners. 12 hours after I-73 sank, a Navy dive team located the wreck in 340 feet of water. The submarine had settled on the ocean floor mostly intact, bow pointed down, stern elevated. Visibility was poor. The current was strong. But the divers had specific orders: recover anything related to communications equipment or documentation. It took 3 dives over 2 days before a Navy salvage specialist named Chief Petty Officer Robert Morrison found the satchel. It had wedged itself between a torpedo tube and a support beam in the forward compartment, preserved by the water-resistant leather and the speed with which the submarine had flooded. Morrison didn't know what he had. He only knew the satchel was heavy and locked. He brought it to the surface, still dripping with seawater, and handed it to a lieutenant who immediately recognized the significance. Within 4 hours, the satchel was in Commander Rochefort's hands at Station Hypo. Rochefort opened it on a steel table surrounded by his senior cryptanalysts. Inside was the JN-25 codebook, damp but readable, with water damage along the edges, but the interior pages largely intact. Also in the satchel were 3 notebooks containing Nakagawa's personal logs of recent encoding work, showing plaintext messages alongside their encrypted equivalents. It was the cryptographic equivalent of finding the Rosetta Stone. Rochefort looked at the codebook for a long moment without speaking. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, his second in command, stood beside him and said quietly that this changed everything. Rochefort nodded and immediately ordered complete security lockdown. Nobody outside Station Hypo could know about this. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The work began immediately. Rochefort's team photographed every page of the codebook, creating multiple copies. They cross-referenced the 5-digit groups with months of intercepted messages they had stored. Patterns that had been mysterious suddenly became clear. The number group 87321, which appeared in dozens of messages, meant carrier. The group 45916 meant Midway Island. The group 72803 meant invasion. The team worked in shifts around the clock, rebuilding the architecture of Japanese naval communications from the foundation up. They could suddenly read not just individual words but entire sentences, operational orders, fleet movements, supply schedules. Within a week, they had decrypted 70% of their backlog of intercepted messages. Within 2 weeks, they were reading new Japanese transmissions almost as quickly as the intended recipients. In early May 1942, Station Hypo began intercepting messages about a major operation designated AF. The messages indicated a large-scale attack planned for early June, involving multiple carrier groups, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and troop transports. The Japanese were preparing the largest naval operation since the attack on Pearl Harbor, but the messages used the designation AF without clarifying the location. Rochefort's team could read the tactical details, but not the strategic target. They knew the Japanese were planning something massive. They didn't know where. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, needed to know. He couldn't disperse his limited forces to defend every possible target. The Americans had 3 aircraft carriers operational in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Japanese had at least 6, possibly 8. Every strategic decision would be a gamble, unless they could determine where the attack would occur. Rochefort believed AF meant Midway Island, a small atoll roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It was the logical target, the forward American outpost that threatened Japanese supply lines. But other intelligence officers argued AF could mean Hawaii itself, or possibly the Aleutian Islands, or even the American West Coast. Without confirmation, Nimitz couldn't commit his fleet. Rochefort devised a test. He instructed the garrison at Midway to send an uncoded radio message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down and they were experiencing water shortages. The message was deliberately sent in plain language, on frequencies known to be monitored by Japanese listening posts. Then Rochefort's team waited. 2 days later, they intercepted a Japanese naval intelligence report stating that AF was experiencing freshwater supply problems. It was confirmation. AF meant Midway. The attack was coming. The intercepted messages revealed the Japanese plan in extraordinary detail. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was committing virtually the entire combined fleet to the operation: 4 large aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 12 destroyers. The invasion force included troop transports carrying 2,500 soldiers. The operation would begin with a massive airstrike to destroy American air defenses on Midway, followed by amphibious landings. The Japanese expected the American carriers to respond from Hawaii, at which point Yamamoto's main battle fleet positioned to the west would destroy them. It was an elaborate trap designed to eliminate American carrier power in the Pacific once and for all. But Rochefort knew all of it. He knew the Japanese order of battle. He knew their timing. He knew their approach routes. He even knew the radio call signs for individual squadron commanders. Station Hypo prepared detailed intelligence summaries showing exactly where each Japanese carrier group would be at specific times on specific dates. When Rochefort presented this information to Admiral Nimitz in late May, the room fell silent. Nimitz asked how confident Rochefort was in the intelligence. Rochefort said he would stake his career on it. Nimitz studied the intelligence summaries for several minutes, then made his decision. The Pacific Fleet would set an ambush north of Midway. Every available carrier would be positioned to strike the Japanese fleet as it approached. The Americans would not react to the attack, they would anticipate it. Lieutenant Commander Nakagawa, interned at a prisoner-of-war camp on Oahu, knew nothing of this. He had endured interrogation sessions where American intelligence officers asked him about codes and communications procedures. He had said nothing, adhering to his training, protecting his service. He assumed the codebook had gone down with I-73, lost in water too deep for recovery. He assumed Japanese naval communications remained secure. He spent his days in the internment camp playing cards with other submarine officers and wondering how long the war would last. He had no idea that his lost satchel had already altered the course of history. June 4, 1942. Dawn broke over Midway Island with clear skies and light winds. The Japanese carriers were exactly where Station Hypo had predicted they would be, 240 miles northwest of the atoll, preparing to launch their first strike wave. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier force from Akagi, confident in his superiority, expecting another easy victory like Pearl Harbor. He had 108 aircraft ready to launch, bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. The American garrison on Midway had 28 aircraft of various types. The mathematics seemed to favor the Japanese overwhelmingly. but 30 miles north. Below the cloud layer, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were already launching their own strike aircraft. Nimitz had positioned them perfectly based on Rochefort's intelligence. The Americans knew exactly where the Japanese carriers would be and exactly when they would be most vulnerable. During flight operations, with aircraft being fueled and armed on the flight decks, with damage control teams focused on launch procedures rather than defensive readiness. The timing had to be precise. Too early, and they would miss the carriers. Too late, and the Japanese Combat Air Patrol would be positioned to intercept them. Rochefort's decrypts had provided the exact schedule. The American strike launched at 0630 hours. The battle that followed became the turning point of the Pacific War. American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese carriers at precisely the moment when their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had been drawn low by an earlier, unsuccessful torpedo attack, exactly as American planners had hoped. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were struck by bombs that ignited fuel lines, ammunition stores, and parked aircraft. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became floating infernos. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack that damaged Yorktown, but American dive bombers found Hiryu later that afternoon and left her burning. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were either sunk or sinking. Japan lost more than 300 aircraft and thousands of experienced pilots and crewmen. The Americans lost 1 carrier and 147 aircraft. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the operation from battleship Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the reports in stunned silence. His carefully planned ambush had become a catastrophic defeat. The Americans had been waiting for him. They had known his plan. They had positioned their forces with impossible precision. Yamamoto immediately suspected intelligence compromise, but he had no way of knowing how deep the breach extended. Japanese naval intelligence assured him that JN-25 remained secure, that no codebooks had been lost or captured. The official explanation for Midway became bad luck and tactical mistakes. The truth remained hidden. Station Hypo continued reading Japanese naval communications for the remainder of 1942 and into 1943. Rochefort's team tracked fleet movements, supply convoys, and operational planning across the entire Pacific theater. They provided advance warning of attacks in the Solomon Islands, allowing American forces to prepare defensive positions. They identified submarine patrol routes, enabling American destroyers to hunt Japanese submarines with unusual success. They pinpointed Japanese supply convoys, allowing American submarines to intercept them far from shore. The intelligence derived from Nakagawa's lost codebook contributed to dozens of Allied victories throughout 1942 and 1943, though the full extent remained classified for decades. Nakagawa was repatriated to Japan in 1945 after the end of hostilities. He returned to a country devastated by years of war, its cities in ruins, its military defeated, its empire dissolved. He learned about the Battle of Midway, about the loss of the 4 carriers, about how the tide of the war had turned so dramatically. He never learned that his lost codebook had played a role in that turning. American authorities maintained absolute secrecy about the cryptographic breakthrough. Officially, the victory at Midway was attributed to superior American tactics and fortunate timing. The full story of Station Hypo and the captured codebook remained classified until 1977, 32 years after the war ended. When the story finally emerged through declassified documents, military historians were able to trace the intelligence chain from I-73 to Midway. The captured codebook had provided the foundation for Station Hypo's success. Without it, American codebreakers would likely have continued struggling with JN-25 for many more months, possibly not achieving a reliable breakthrough until mid to late 1943. The Battle of Midway might never have occurred, or it might have occurred under very different circumstances. The entire trajectory of the Pacific War could have followed a different path, potentially lasting months or years longer, with dramatically different outcomes. One submarine officer's lost satchel, wedged between a torpedo tube and a support beam, had influenced the fate of nations. Rochefort was quietly promoted and transferred to other duties after Midway, his role in the victory kept secret. He received no public recognition during his lifetime, no medals for his contribution to the greatest naval victory in American history. The men and women of Station Hypo worked in anonymity, their achievements hidden behind layers of classification. Rochefort died in 1976, 1 year before the full story was declassified. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in 1986, 44 years after Midway. Nakagawa lived until 1991, settling in Yokohama after the war, working as an accountant for a shipping company. He rarely spoke about his submarine service. When asked about the war, he would say only that he had done his duty and survived. In his later years, he read histories of the Pacific War with particular attention to the Battle of Midway, trying to understand how the Americans had known so much, how they had positioned their forces so perfectly. He never connected his lost satchel to that battle. The American declassifications in 1977 focused on Station Hypo's methods and achievements, not on the specific source of the captured codebook. Japanese military historians eventually traced the compromise to I-73, but by that time, Nakagawa was elderly, and the revelation would have served no purpose. He died without knowing the full consequence of those desperate moments in a flooding submarine compartment. The JN-25 codebook recovered from I-73 is now preserved in the National Security Agency archive in Fort Meade, Maryland. It sits in a climate-controlled vault alongside other significant cryptographic artifacts, Enigma machines, Soviet cipher equipment, Vietnamese codebooks. Visitors to the NSA Museum can see a replica, though the original remains too fragile for display. The leather is cracked and water-stained. Many pages are brittle with age, but every 5-digit number group is still legible, still a testament to how much history can turn on small moments and lost objects. The Battle of Midway is studied in military academies worldwide as an example of intelligence-driven warfare, though the full story of Station Hypo's preparation is less widely known. Students learn about the tactical decisions, the dive bomber attacks, the burning carriers. They learn less about Commander Rochefort's basement office, about the months of tireless decryption work, about the test message regarding freshwater supplies. They learn almost nothing about Lieutenant Commander Nakagawa standing in a flooding submarine compartment, watching his satchel slide away into dark water, making a split-second decision that shaped the outcome of the largest war in human history. Modern military communication security doctrine traces its origins partly to the lessons of JN-25. The Japanese military's failure to detect the compromise, to rotate their codes more frequently, to implement additional security layers, became textbook examples of what not to do. Contemporary encrypted communications use multiple redundant systems specifically to prevent a single captured device or lost codebook from compromising an entire network. The principle is simple. Assume anything physical can be lost or captured. Design your security accordingly. It's a lesson written in water-stained leather and 5-digit number groups, purchased with 4 aircraft carriers and thousands of lives. In the small details lie the largest truths. A submarine pushed too close to shore. Depth charges landing with precision. A satchel slipping from desperate hands. A dive team finding it wedged in wreckage. A codebreaker opening water-damaged pages in a basement office. An admiral making decisions based on intelligence he could trust completely. Dive bombers arriving at exactly the right moment over flight decks crowded with vulnerable aircraft. 4 carriers burning under clear Pacific skies. An empire's expansion halted, the tide of war turning on decisions made in darkness and desperation. The war in the Pacific lasted 3 more years after Midway. Millions more would serve. Hundreds of thousands more would perish. Islands would be fought over yard by yard. Cities would burn. But the mathematics of the conflict changed fundamentally on June 4, 1942. Japan lost its offensive capability. America gained strategic initiative. The path from Midway led eventually to the Philippines, to Okinawa, to the home islands themselves. Every subsequent American victory in the Pacific built on the foundation established that morning over the waters northwest of a small atoll, when American dive bombers fell out of the sky onto carriers that had no idea they were coming. Nakagawa's satchel represented something more profound than just military intelligence. It embodied the fragility of secrecy, the impossibility of perfect security, the way even the most carefully guarded systems contain vulnerabilities that cannot be eliminated entirely. The Japanese believed their codes were unbreakable. They had designed JN-25 with sophisticated safeguards. They distributed codebooks only to trusted officers. They implemented procedures for destruction in case of compromise. But procedures fail when submarines are sinking and water is rising and men are fighting for their lives. In those moments, protocol gives way to chaos, and chaos creates opportunities that planning cannot prevent. The individuals who lived through these events mostly carried their stories quietly. Nakagawa never spoke of his lost satchel. Rochefort rarely discussed his work at Station Hypo. The dive team members who recovered the satchel were sworn to secrecy. The pilots who struck the carriers at Midway knew only that they had been in the right place at the right time, not why. History happened through their actions, but understanding of that history remained fragmented, compartmented, hidden behind classification barriers that persisted for decades. The full picture emerged slowly, through archival releases, through memoir publications, through historical research that connected fragments into coherent narrative. What remains clear is that individual actions, taken in crisis moments without full awareness of their significance, ripple outward in ways that reshape the world. Nakagawa made a decision in fractions of a second, whether to go back into flooding compartment for his satchel or accept rescue and survive. He chose survival. That choice was understandable, human, rational. It was also consequential beyond any measure he could have imagined. His lost codebook became the thread that, when pulled, unraveled Japanese naval security across the Pacific. The intelligence that followed enabled American commanders to make decisions with confidence rather than gambling on uncertainty. Those decisions led to victories. Those victories accumulated into triumph. That triumph reshaped the political order of the entire Pacific region for the next 80 years. The ocean keeps many secrets, but sometimes it releases them to those who know where to look. A 73 sat on the ocean floor for decades after the war, gradually corroding, eventually collapsing into itself. The forward compartment where Nakagawa lost his satchel is now barely recognizable, covered in marine growth, home to fish and crustaceans that know nothing of codes or carriers or empires. But the ripples from that moment continue spreading. They're visible in the world we inhabit today, in the borders on maps, in the alliances between nations, in the language of international commerce, in the strategic balances that shape global politics. One satchel, one flooding compartment. One moment of desperate choice. Everything afterward carried the weight of that moment, though few understood why at the time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.